Is it just me, or have you been looking around at the state of the world and thinking that democracy doesn't work? When democracy was invented in ancient Greece, it was used in city-states and was restricted to only the landowning men. That form of democracy is now called direct democracy. In a direct democracy, every voter either personally knows, or at least knows someone who personally knows, each candidate. This system is nearly impossible to scale due to how much time human interactions take. There is a definitive limit on how many people a ruler or candidate can personally know. An alternate election method tested in ancient times was drawing lots. Being the governor meant being unable to do your regular work for a year, so people actually didn't want to do it, since their land would go into disrepair. I'll come back to this later. Later on, forms of representative democracy were tried, so that more densely populated and larger geographic areas could try voting. This too had limitations. People could vote for a local representative they might have heard a speech from during his or her campaign, but that representative had no way of validating what their constituents thought about new issues as they arose and needed his or her vote. Not knowing the candidate personally, it became difficult for voters to tell which candidate best matched their own opinions across a broad range of topics. This difficulty led to the creation of political parties, where people from many cities and towns would agree upon a set of core values to vote with if they got elected, and communicated those core values to their constituents. This way, a voter could see which party's set of core values best matched their own, even if they didn't know an individual candidate. However, there was no structure to ensure that each candidate followed through with this. Candidates from the same party could advertise wildly different core values in different geographic areas, or candidates could ignore those core values once actually elected. The latter was a problem with the pre-party representative democracies and the direct democracies as well, although it was harder for a direct democracy candidate to get away with lying or radically changing their opinions, since they would still have to face the people who voted for them almost every day. We use that phrase, to face their constituents, even in modern times, but we don't mean it literally. The candidates we have in modern times don't have to interact face-to-face with more than 50% of their constituents on a daily basis, or even on an annual basis. I've heard the founding fathers of the United States of America warned that political parties would be detrimental to the system they hoped to establish, but who cares what they thought? Within representative party democracies, several strategies have been used, such as a one-party system in which the party is meant to adapt to the changing views of society, but can often fall into dictatorship, or a two-party system which is meant to enable simple majority rule, but can easily fall into collusion, or a multi-party system which is meant to facilitate cooperation and compromise between different segments of the population, but can easily fall into gridlock. Different methods of counting votes have also been tried. Single winner systems use only one representative per district, and the winner of the entire country is usually the party with the most districts, which may not match the popular vote. Even if the national level did use the popular vote, it would still be choosing a single winner. Plurality voting is an offshoot of this, but the winner doesn't need more than half the votes or districts as long as it has more than any other party. Runoff elections are the opposite, where the winner must have more than half the votes per district and more than half the districts. If this doesn't happen after the first round of voting, the parties with the least votes are excluded from the choices for a second round of voting. This can even be done in one step, with the voter ranking their choices instead of just marking a single candidate. If the party of their first choice is among the lowest voted parties, their second choice is used instead, and so on until a party has more than half of the votes. Positional systems further refine the ranked choice system by having second choice votes count less than first choice votes, and third choice votes count less than second choice votes, and so on. Multi-winner systems usually have multiple elected officials per district, so the elected officials per district more closely match the vote count percentages of that district. The national leader would be from the party with the most elected officials, but they typically have less power individually and may even be substituted for a non-party official who attempts to represent the mix of elected officials when communicating internationally. Each of these systems may have separate primary elections where people vote on which candidates should represent which party. These primary elections can either be open, allowing all people to vote, or closed, meaning only party members can vote. I feel this undermines the design of representative party democracy. If the members are supposed to set aside their personal views and go with the party's core values, then it shouldn't matter who they are. In reality, we know that many members of parties do ignore their party's core values, so this is a band-aid solution to try to exclude those dishonest actors from the party. There is one issue that none of these systems resolve. The national leader is only ever one person who is extremely susceptible to corruption, and, even if they are honest, cannot accurately represent a fragmented parliament. This single leader is a vestigial remnant of monarchy and dictatorship. This person communicates the decisions of parliament and acts as a negotiator with foreign nations. Except they don't. Most of the communication voters receive does not come from the head of state. It comes from people such as the press secretary, or political advertising campaign manager, or an agreed-upon public communication drafted and edited by many elected officials and their assistants. Most of the negotiation with foreign nations is not done by the head of state. It is done by ambassadors and foreign affairs ministers and other specialized officials. Some nations do give decision-making power to the head of state, which I view as endorsing corruption and begging for dictatorship to return. I hope that the next political system that replaces democracy will not have a head of state. Imagine if people had to face the reality. Their government is not ruled by a single party, and hasn't been for hundreds of years. Their government is actually a mix of different parties, as well as independent elected officials, and that mix more accurately represents their nation. Canada doesn't magically flip from being racist one year to being not racist the next year. It really just fluctuated by 2% or so in racism. And we have drawn an arbitrary line, so anything over 20% or so is what the nation is, and anything under 20% is just a fringe minority. I say 20% on purpose. That isn't a mistake. I really mean 20%. Let me explain. In most Canadian elections, voter turnout is between 45 and 65% of the eligible voters. The winning party typically gets between 40 and 65% of the seats, or between 30 and 70% of the popular vote. The eligible voters comprise between 70 and 75% of the total population. Best case scenario, 75% of the population is eligible, 65% of them vote, and the winning party gets 70% of the popular vote. That's 34.125% of the population. Best case scenario. Worst case scenario, 70% of the population is eligible, 40% of them vote, and the winning party gets 30% of the popular vote. That's 8.4% of the population. If we take the population of Canada in 2021, the year of the most recent federal election, there were 38.24 million people. The winning party has 5.556629 million votes, which is 14.5% of the population at the time. Again, I did not choose the number 20% randomly. It accurately reflects the percentage of the total population which voted for the winning party in many federal elections. Imagine parallel timelines. In one, our history, the 2021 election finishes and the Liberal Party is declared leader of Canada. And they get to choose the staff that represent the Canadian government to other nations as well as to the Canadian people. In the second timeline, the result of the 2020 election is exactly the same, but there is no national figurehead. Instead, we proudly declare to the world that we have 160 Liberal seats, 119 Conservative seats, 32 Bloc Québécois seats, 25 NDP seats, 2 Green seats, and they should expect our negotiations to reflect this instead of any singular party. In the third timeline, the results are the same, but we declare the percentage of popular vote support. 32.62% Liberal, 33.74% Conservative, 7.64% Bloc, 17.82% NDP, 2.33% Green, and 4.94% People's Party. In the fourth timeline, the results are the same, but we declare the percentage of the population. 14.5% Liberal, 15% Conservative, 3.4% Bloc, 7.9% NDP, 1% Green, 2.2% People's Party, and, drumroll please, 56% none of the above. How would a figurehead even attempt to represent the population in negotiations and lawmaking decisions when the figurehead doesn't know the opinion of 56% of the population? And yet, this is what really happened. The rounding might be off by a bit, but the number of votes in the total population doesn't change. According to the Canadian Constitution and the definition of democracy, our elected government is supposed to represent the people, which means every single decision that they have made for the past 4 years should have been, we don't know, we have to do a referendum because we don't know the opinion of more than half the population, and therefore it would be immoral and unconstitutional for us to decide on their behalf. It is my opinion that every elected official in Canada should immediately resign or work to rule, citing that they are not capable of representing their constituents under the current electoral system. This extremely low voter turnout is not unique to Canada. USA usually has lower voter turnout than Canada. India, famous for its electronic voting, even taking tablets with pictures instead of names to illiterate rural areas, still struggles to get over 70% voter turnout. And that is of the voting eligible population. Many countries ban incarcerated people from voting. Most, if not all, countries ban children and young teenagers from voting. If I were in charge of electoral reform, I would take a phased approach and try out as many radical ideas as I could until I found something that worked. Here are some examples of radical ideas. Number 1, lower the voting age to 8 instead of 18. The government controls schools that impact much of these people's lives, and they have no say over it. By age 8, most children have basic critical thinking skills and basic literacy. As the digital era continues, we may need to lower this even further to 4 years old. 2, eliminate all barriers to voting. If you have a SIN number, that means you are either a citizen, permanent resident, or temporary resident with legal right to work. In other words, if you have a SIN number, you should be able to vote. If, combined with the earlier idea, this would mean issuing SIN numbers to people at a younger age. You shouldn't need to register, you shouldn't need photo ID, you just need your SIN number. Number 3, eliminate the anonymous ballot. Label each ballot with each SIN number and have that information publicly available after the election. Number 4. Expand the number of members of parliament to be 0.1% of the population. Instead of having 338 or 0.001% of the population as federal members of parliament, make it 40,100 and have their seats filled based on the national popular vote, or percentage of the population, purposefully leaving empty seats to represent non-voters. Number 5. Ban legalese. If something is not understandable to the average Canadian, then it should not be used against them. Their rights and responsibilities should be easily understood with as little gray area as possible. Number 6. Replace the Senate, House of Commons, and Prime Minister's votes on bills, laws, and regulations with referendums. Elected officials would still draft the legislation, but would not decide whether or not to enact it. Instead, the people would vote on each legislation in a referendum. Number 7. Enact a maximum age for candidates and government workers. No one over the age of retirement should be allowed to control the lives of future generations. Period. Number 8. Reduce the requirements for candidates and government-appointed officials. If a person can vote, they can hold office. Number 9. Eliminate provincial governments. Divide up their duties between municipal and federal governments. Number 10. Input expiry dates on all legislation. Expiry dates must not be more than 20 years beyond the time of implementation. Start by expiring the oldest 5% of legislation next year, and continuing to expire 5% of historical legislation each year for 20 years. We do not need to be ruled over by long-dead people who likely only represented 15 to 20% of the population at the time. Number 11. Implement a single strike rule for elected officials. If they vote against the majority of their constituents once, they are banned from holding government positions for the rest of their life. Number 12. Enact a single salary for government employees. Post office deliveries, prime minister, polling attendant, and federal judges all get the same salary as each other. Determining what that salary may be can be subject to a referendum or a vote among all government employees, similar to a union vote. This salary should not be lower than a minimum wage. Number 13. Remember I mentioned drawing lots to elect a leader instead of voting? Well, that seems like a radical idea. Let's try it. 40,100 SIN numbers chosen at random become the federal officials for a period of 2 years. Assistants would be hired to ensure anyone who is not technologically savvy can participate in remote governmental work. After the first 2 years, the random selection process is revised to exclude any that have already served, and new SIN numbers are continuously added to the list. Number 14. Instead of 1 vote per person, try 1 vote per hour worked in the past year. Radical ideas here, not necessarily good ones. Number 15. How about instead of having a federal budget decided upon by elected officials, we have a poll where each person has 100 points to allocate between the categories of federal spending. Each person assigns those points to the various categories as they choose. The categories would be the things that the government spent money on the previous year, and a fill-in-the-blank line at the bottom if someone wants the government to spend money on something new. We should show in the poll what last year's percentages were. Those 100 points represent percentages, and when we average out all the poll results, that should give us a specific percentage of federal revenue to spend on each category, plus a certain percentage that needs to be split among all the write-in requests. I welcome all my viewers to write in why they think any of these radical ideas would be good or bad for Canada, but please don't use the logic that it hasn't been done before, or we don't know what the results will be. That's the goal. We are trying to address the global problem of governments not representing their people. We need new ideas because old ideas have already failed. Let me preempt some objections that I've already heard. You can't pay politicians a low amount, otherwise they will take bribes. Really? So, post office workers are already taking bribes to deliver some people's mail faster than others. I can bribe my local post office to stop delivering mail to someone I don't like. They make pretty low salaries. It would probably take months or years for someone to prove that letters were missed intentionally rather than by accident. No, I reject your objection. Usually, bribes are taken by wealthy people. So, having less of them in government should actually reduce bribery, especially if government salary is public knowledge. It would be really easy to spot anyone living beyond their means and investigate them. You can't let children vote. They would just vote for whoever their parents tell them to. Yeah, I bet some would, and I bet some wouldn't. Is every 10-year-old really perfectly obedient? Have you never heard of a rebellious teenager before? And how is this so different from people voting for who their church leader likes, or from a 20-year-old voting for who their parents like? There is nothing magical about age 18 or 19 that frees people from indoctrination or manipulation. You can't write laws in plain English. It would be too easy for people to find loopholes. Really? You think there would be less loopholes if the laws were easily understood, rather than being extremely difficult for even federal judges to interpret? I think I'd rather see those loopholes for myself, rather than using the current failed system. You can't use referendums for everything. People wouldn't have enough time to understand each issue. I see this as an argument in support of monarchy. Monarchs are raised from birth to have maximum knowledge of government, so any elected official that used to work at McDonald's must be less skilled than a monarch. But really, yes, I understand that some referendums will come out where a bunch of people, maybe even the majority, don't understand the question or don't have an opinion. To me, that is still better than having these decisions made by people who, on paper, represent 15% of the population and have no regulations holding them to actually represent those people. We can't eliminate the anonymous ballot. There would be a social ostracization and possibly physical violence. Yeah, maybe there will be, or maybe there won't be. But your argument is the same one behind the don't ask, don't tell rule in the military, and leads to LGBT people being forced into the closet. We already have so many people displaying their voting intentions with public signs on their private property, and there haven't been many violent attacks from that. Maybe some damaged signs, but no one's burning down their neighbor's house for having a political sign that they disagree with. I say let the minority voters out of the closet. You can't expire laws. That could be a slippery slope towards reversing social progress, or it might be difficult for people to keep up with the changes. People already can't keep up with the changes. I doubt that more than 0.01% of the population has read the new laws that came into effect this year. Some legislation already has expiry dates, such as the COVID relief payments, or the federal budget, which expires every year. So this is no different. And if you're worried about reversing social progress, and your plan to increase progress is to tether yourself to ancient history, then I have some bad news for you. If you honestly think that people are going to vote in a referendum to reallow slavery in Canada, or to disallow women votes, or to disallow gay marriage, then I challenge you to go check the polling data on those things. The point of having legislation that expires is for it to be reviewed before the expiry date. How would expiry dates work on legislation that has been revised by newer legislation? That's a legitimate question. I would err on the side of the whole revised piece using the original expiry date, but that's mostly because I don't trust the current corrupt system. If I trusted the elected officials to be honest, instead of annually adding spelling or grammar changes through legislation that the public no longer supports, then I might allow it to use the new expiry date. Oh, and if you think 20 years isn't long enough to review and either cancel or renew all existing legislation, then you're admitting 20 years isn't long enough to learn all existing legislation, and thus our entire system is illegitimate because the judges and the law writers are ignorant of the current laws. Using 1 vote per hour worked instead of 1 vote per person would disenfranchise retired people, children, disabled people, and new parents. This is a legitimate concern, and one of the reasons why I called out that radical idea as being not necessarily good. I think I would still like to try it for 1 election, just to see what happens. If you think you have a better idea of how to make the government actually represent the people instead of only 15% of the people, then please let me know in the comments or send me a response video.